Hello everyone, it's Jeff Rich here and welcome to the third of my episodes from 100 Books to Read Before It's Too Late, Read Before You Die if you like. In the previous episodes I've looked at books 1 to 20 on my list. The full list you can read at my Substack at jeffrich.substack.com. And it represents 100 books from many cultures around the world, including many winners of the Nobel Prize in Literature, that are really worth reading and represent not just, I guess, literary standards, but also a desire to appreciate, understand and connect with many cultures and literatures from around the world and the history of those countries as well. I read literature, I guess, to some degree as a historian, both to appreciate the art, but also to understand the context, the history, the times, the people from which that literature sprang. And the list of 10 novels, primarily books, literary books that I'm going to share with you today, span continents and include some of the greatest novels of the 20th century, including some written in the 1920s, 100 years ago. So the first of the books that I'm going to tell you about is one of the books I know least well, but when I did review my list, I found I did not have enough African literature. It is one of the gaps in my knowledge, but this book has frequently been recommended. It's by Chinua Achebe. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Things Fall Apart. Achebe was a Nigerian novelist born in the 1930s, grew up in colonial Nigeria and experienced, I guess, decolonization as well. The first waves of decolonization really began in after the First World War. And accelerated after 1945. I'll talk more about that at my History channel at the Burning Archive History channel shortly. And the story of Things Fall Apart involves a central character, Okonkwo, who is a sort of village leader from a warrior tradition who had a bit of a poor role model as a father. Which he very much was, he was the good son who operated against, and he very much, spent his life opposing that, and then, or acting in a different way, but was very worried that his son was going to be like his wastrel father. Anyhow, that central family drama is part of the story, but it is also a story of conflicting social ethoses in colonial Nigeria between the colonizers and the colonized, between the different tribes and or the different social groups and the different villages. Okonkwo is involved in a major incident that leads him to be kind of exiled from his village. He then experiences, the harshness of British colonialism, rebels, and the novel ends in a complex tragedy. Of course, I'm not going to spoil the story for you. The title of the book comes from a great poem, a very well-known poem by W.B. Yeats, William Butler Yeats, the winner of the 1923 Nobel Prize in Literature, The Second Coming. Things fall apart, the centre cannot hold. That is the title of the book, Things Fall Apart. It describes both this world of colonialism and imperial power disintegrating, but also the worlds of the colonised disintegrating as well, their personal values, their individual integrity. It is an absolute classic of modern African literature, so do check it out. The second book is Dr. Faustus by Thomas Mann, the 1929 winner of the Nobel Prize in Literature. Thomas Mann wrote Dr. Faustus, I think in the 1940s. He might have even been writing, it was published in 1947, I just checked with my notes. He would have been writing it either during or at the end of World War II. And Thomas Mann fled Nazi Germany in the 1930s, ended up as a kind of celebrity exile in the United States of America, a place he didn't really find all that appealing. And the story of Dr. Faustus, of course, uses the European Renaissance medieval tradition or legend of Dr. Faustus, who sells his soul to the devil, to Mephistopheles. And he uses this legend both to explore, I guess, German, the German question: why did this highly cultured, civilized, country, which was really, I guess, the cultural capital of the world in the early part of the 20th century, the intellectual capital of the world in many ways, why did it succumb to the fascist politics of the National Socialist Party in the 1930s and 1940s? But more than that, it also explores the strange, intimate connection between modernist art and the striving to transcend the limits of humanity almost in modernist art, and that same kind of noxious politics. There were, of course, quite a few artists, intellectuals, Martin Heidegger, many others, many of Thomas Mann's acquaintance, who did indeed succumb to the politics. And the central character of Dr. Faustus is in fact a composer, Adrian Leverkuhn, who similarly makes a pact with the devil for his artistic genius, his ability to create great modernist works of art. It is said that to some degree, I think Leverkuhn is based on the serialist composer, one of the great sort of avant-garde composers, I guess, of the 20th century, modernist composers, Arnold Schoenberg. The story explores the mixed story of Germany's fall during fascism, World War II, and modernist art's similar fall in many ways. It is a profound story, of course, perhaps best appreciated with all the German literary and cultural references, but by all means do read it. The third book is also by Thomas Mann, and I actually have a copy which I read late last year, Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain, Der Zauberberg. It is a classic novel, and of course I did a video on it on this channel earlier this year, so do check it out. There'll be a link to that in the video description. The story and Magic Mountain was published in 1924, so last year was the centenary of its publication. And it is a fascinating exploration of the culture of Europe, particularly Central Europe, German Europe, which, as I said, was kind of, we look back now and think Germany is, under the shadow of Nazism. But, in the first half of the 20th century, Germany is very much the cultural centre of Europe and exerts a great pan-Germanic influence. That's part of the reason why Europe, certain people and elites across Europe succumbed to the appeal of Nazi Germany in the 1920s and 1930s. Magic Mountain follows a character, Hans Castorp, I always have to check whether it's Castorp or Castrop, but it's Castorp. It follows this character, Hans Castorp, who's a young engineer who goes to a sanatorium for, like pneumonia, tuberculosis, which was, a common thing. Tuberculosis clinics, sanatoria were common in the early part of the 20th century before, modern medical techniques for dealing with tuberculosis and dealing with infectious disease were more well established. But it's a very odd sanatorium. There's certainly certain forms of medical treatment, but it's also an exploration of, psychoanalysis, which was emerging then, of the discussions of what is modern Western civilization. And this impending sense of the doom that is about to descend upon Europe in World War I, not just Europe, of course, but many parts of the world. And so it is a brilliant novel. Now, it is a demanding read in some ways. I did explain some of the reasons that even though it is a demanding read, it is a great read in a video I did earlier this year. But I really do recommend everyone do read Hans Castorp, and it helps us realise, how profoundly influential still today the great conflict of World War I, as much as World War II was in shaping our modern consciousness and the consciousness of modernism and what the idea of the West really is. The fourth book is also by Thomas Mann. I also have a copy of it here. It's Buddenbrooks. It's a more, a more easily read novel, if you like, perhaps a more conventional novel. In many ways, Magic Mountain is a novel of ideas, of debate and conversation, whereas Buddenbrooks is a more conventional narrative novel of a business family in Germany in the late 19th, early 20th century, and it's the dynasty story of that family and how it moves from one generation to another. It was one of his earliest novels, published in 1901 when Thomas Mann was just 26, and it's a family saga. It's the novel that was quoted in his Nobel Prize nomination, even though, of course, The Magic Mountain is perhaps his more profound reflection, had been published before Mann won the prize. In many ways, there were many reasons, why Thomas Mann would have been nominated for the Nobel Prize in Literature. It follows the story of the four generations of the Buddenbrook family, who were wealthy grain merchants in the city of Lübeck, and how the family's vitality sort of declines. The founder of the business, the sons and the grandsons and the great-grandsons ultimately become rather less talented, rather less driven by the ethical cause. But in exploring that, it also explores the nature of German society and culture, and the commercial middle-class culture that, to some degree, Thomas Mann was born into and rebelled against in his own aesthetic practice in a certain way, because Thomas Mann himself grew up in a merchant family in Lübeck, and chose a different path, and had many complex, subtle relationships to the nature of the German culture that he both rebelled against and also admired. The fifth book in this group of 10 is actually more than one book. I have just one of the 7 volumes, Marcel Proust, sometimes translated as In Search of Lost Time, sometimes translated in the Scott Moncrieff edition, the English translator from the, 1920s. Scott Moncrief translated it using a phrase from a Shakespeare sonnet in remembrance of things past. In many ways, the more literal translation, à la recherche de temps perdu, in search of lost time, or the search for lost time, is a more directly meaningful, accurate description of the novel. It is the search of the narrator, who is a kind of alter ego of Marcel Proust himself, trying to recover the memories, trying to make sense of his life, trying to make sense of why he had wasted so much of his life in his search to create an artwork and yet always procrastinating about it. It, of course, begins with a very famous passage of 50 pages or so of the young Marcel or Marcel Proust who famously sat in a cork-lined room in Paris where he wrote the book, largely confined to bed, partly because of hay fever, seasonal allergies, those kind of asthma, those kind of things, partly because of a kind of a withdrawal that he practiced and in a way explored very, very deeply in Search of Lost Time. But the opening passage, describes him recalling the denial of a goodnight kiss from his mother, and this sort of detailed, elegant, almost philosophical, you could say, but also luxuriously sensual sort of description of memories, of sensory observations, of reflections on culture and history and family and the nature of the times in which he lived. It too is in some ways a bit like The Magic Mountain. It too is, although begun before the World War I, does reflect upon World War I. There's many scenes in the book which actually describe Paris and France during the war, and is one of the great, great novels that actually describes the transitory generation that really created modernism in that period between 1890, 1930 or so. And that in many ways, for me at least, has defined the sort of cultural horizons of my life. It is one of the great books. I read it initially in my early 20s, and have read it a few times since. Multiple translations, all of which have their strengths, but I do highly recommend you do read In Search of Lost Time, and treat it as like a long series of essays almost, that you don't necessarily all need to read in one sitting, one determined session, that you can sort of dwell on and come back to and reflect upon. It is truly a great, great novel. Okay, book 6 is The Unbearable Lightness of Being by the Czech writer Milan Kundera. There was a film made of this book, of course, not so long ago. And it is a book that was published in 1984 while Kundera was in exile from then communist Czechoslovakia before the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Velvet Revolution. And it follows 4 characters through the famous 1968 or late 1960s Prague Spring, which culminated in the repression of this sort of cultural and political movement of alternative culture and of a different way within a socialist state. A turn perhaps to more Western liberalism, but also in a way part of a more global cultural response to the late 1960s. It wasn't just the streets of Paris or the streets of Chicago that were, in tumult in 1968. Many parts of the world, both the communist world and also the developing world, were also in turmoil in that period. The four characters are Thomas, a surgeon who has, a bit of a classic dual relationship between his wife Teresa and his mistress, girlfriend, lover, Sabina. And Teresa is a photographer who has, mixed feelings of jealousy and idealism. Sabina is an artist who values freedom. It was very much a value of the 1960s. And Franz, who is Sabina's lover and represents a kind of naive Western belief that, maybe oppression in communist Czechoslovakia was not so bad. Milan Kundera, was of the same generation as Václav Havel, who sought, in a way, a kind of release from the restraints on the way one actually lived that occurred in post-totalitarian societies. I did a reading or a commentary on Václav Havel's famous essay, The Power of the Powerless, published in 1978. So before this great novel, The Unbearable Lightness of Being. And of course, it is a fascinating book that does explore experiences in, the dissident community, you could say, within Czechoslovakia during the Cold War, well before the end of that regime. The seventh book is The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. It's the 100th anniversary of the publication of F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby this year, published in 1925. And this is, one of the iconic American novels of the jazz age of the 1920s. But in a way, it's also a tragic story of the American dream, but also the complex relationship between America and Europe, a story that we'll come back to in the 10th book in this video. The Gatsby is, a very well-known story. It involves, it's a story about an apparently successful businessman, Gatsby, narrated by Nick Carraway, who is a salesman, who ends up, the neighbour to J. Gatsby on Long Island's North Shore. There are parties, legendary parties, and apparently endless wealth, and also this dream of eternal renewal that Gatsby has about his own enterprises, that in a way has also become the sort of official or the dominant cultural mode of so much American culture, that the American dream can never be defeated, that America can forever renew itself, unlike old dead Europe. But of course, life is not so happy. Gatsby himself, F. Scott Fitzgerald himself, was part of a group of American intellectuals who kind of were discontent with American society in the 1920s, and in the post-World War I conditions of Europe, made a life in Paris, a kind of emigre life, which was part of, the early American exploitation of Europe as a tourist destination. But it is an excellent book. I actually wrote a little piece about it earlier this year on my Substack at jeffrich.substack.com, and I'll include a link to that down below. And you can go to jeffrich.substack.com, become a
a free subscriber, and you can get all my weekly posts on books, history book recommendations, deep dives, guides to history and world affairs, as well as if you become a paid subscriber, you get a lot of deeper dives and richer material into really understanding this changing world that we're living in. Let me return to book 8, and that is by another winner of the Nobel Prize. He's John Steinbeck. And the book is, of course, The Grapes of Wrath. This is a story of Depression America, following the Okies, the sort of migrant rural labourer, impoverished rural labourer workforce in the United States who sort of migrate to California amongst the depression, the drought, and the general sense of social economic collapse. 1930s America, one often forgets, was as deeply affected by the Great Depression as any country in the world, as much really as Germany in the 1930s. And there was significant social problems. Of course, the New Deal in part dealt with those problems, but not all of them. And in many ways, it wasn't really until World War II that the American economy sort of got back on its feet. In the 1930s, John Steinbeck had left-wing sympathies. It's a classic example of social realism in literature, exploring the exploitation, poverty, and prejudices against the sort of Californian workers and how the Jodes had to move from camp to camp, fruit picking, and were rather ruthlessly exploited by Californian fruit growers, as well as subject to all kinds of prejudice. America still has many problems with migrant labour. We've seen that in recent times. And it is perhaps worth rereading Grapes of Wrath. Of course, it's a book many, many, many people have read. And you can also check my guide to John Steinbeck and some of his curious post-1945 reconciliation with the American security state. Yep, that's right. John Steinbeck might have just worked with the intelligence agencies after the war. And his engagement with issues in the Vietnam War in my post on that at my Nobel archive, which is a complete indexed guide, set of articles on all 121 winners of the Nobel Prize in Literature that you can get by becoming a paid subscriber at jeffrich.substack.com. Book 9 is a famous book, another famous book, Arthur Koestler, Darkness at Noon. It was published in 1940. Arthur Koestler was born in Hungary, but like many people of that era, until 1918, Austria-Hungary is a complex, multinational sort of empire, and some nations were really only legally formed in the 1920s following the sort of self-determination, the post-Versailles Conference, and the disintegration of the Ottoman, the Russian, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire after World War I. But Koestler's book explores in a sort of almost George Orwell-ish way, without specific locational references, the nature of the purges and the Yugoslavian terror in Russia, in the Soviet Union, in the late 1930s, just prior to the time that Arthur Koestler wrote the book. Koestler himself did not have direct experience of that. He had some experience of imprisonment during the Spanish Civil War, and immediately afterwards, Spanish Civil War occurs in 1936, and afterwards the Franco regime, which is a sort of Catholic, partly, fascist, I guess, phalangist regime, a kind of a military dictatorship in many ways, a military corporatist dictatorship with a close relationship with the church. It engages in quite a lot of significant repression of left-wing anarchists and other internal critics within Spain. And Koestler does get caught up with this. It is a very famous portrait of the nature of, repressive state apparatuses, of the persecution of people for political ideas, the show trials of the 1930s, and the difficulty of enduring such persecution. Interestingly, I read in preparing this video that there has been a recent fresh translation of Darkness at Noon within the last 10 years. It went through a number of rushed early translations to end up in the English translation, and there were a lot of defects in the English translation. Of course, this is always, especially in the post-war context with discussions of totalitarianism, a very controversial topic, a little bit contaminated by Cold War rhetoric on all sides. But Arthur Koestler's Darkness at Noon is very much recognised as a classic, and I highly recommend that you do read it. The last book, Book 10, is another one of those books that I've only really just sampled, but it's The Age of Innocence by Edith Wharton. And this book takes us to the late 19th century in America, then very closely connected with Europe, in a way very, had what in Australia people used to call cultural cringe about American culture relative to Europe. In many ways, as the historian John Darwin says, that in the 19th century and into the first part of the 20th century, there's really a concept of what he calls Greater Europe. Europe as such, again, not just Western Europe, but Central and Eastern Europe as well. And Russia and North America, all forming three parts of what is kind of the Greater Europe, and all thinking of itself as the West in many ways, asserting its cultural and brutal imperial power all around the world. And America was part of that in many ways. And the elite of America were moved back and forward between Europe and England or Britain to sort of in their sort of lives. The story centres on Newland Archer, who is a wealthy lawyer engaged to a young innocent May Welland. They have a comfortable arrangement, but then May's cousin, Countess Ellen Olenska, arrives, fleeing a violent husband in Europe and wanting a divorce, which is quite a scandal in 1870s New York society. In the late 19th century, there's the early women's rights movement, which is also closely associated with the temperance movement and other kinds of things. So this is an exploration of this. And Wharton published this book just after World War I, of course. And like Proust, like Thomas Mann's Magic Mountain, it is a reflection to some degree on the world that was lost in World War I, the Age of Innocence. Newland is drawn to the Countess Ellen's sophistication and independence and European character There are lots of tropes of, you know, young, new, innocent or naive America, and old, sophisticated, but morally troubled Europe in this discussion. And there is a whole series of events that lead the community of New York to force Ellen back into exile and Newland back into his arranged marriage. So it is an interesting story, a wonderful story that looks back at a pre-war world with both nostalgia and criticism, in a way, in the same way that Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain does as well. Now, you can read my entire list of 100 books to read before it's too late or before you die, to be crude about it. And you can also, you can read that list at jeffrich.substack.com. I'd really love it if you join me there and became a paid subscriber there, because it helps me produce more good content for you, more guides to some of the best books out there. And you can also read there the recent list of 100 poems to read in times of war, some of which I'll be featuring on this channel again soon. Do check that one out too. There's links to all of those in the video below. Check them out, and I will be with you again for the next in my series of 100 books to read before it's too late next week.